Emily was only 24 years old, but life had already given her more struggles than she ever imagined. Every morning she woke up before the sun, pulling herself out of bed in her tiny apartment that was barely big enough for a single person. The walls were thin, the rent was high, and the air inside always felt cold in winter. She often skipped breakfast just to save money, drinking only a glass of water before rushing to work. Her job was at a small cafe downtown, a place where the smell of coffee beans filled the air, and the sound of clinking cups never stopped. She wore the same pair of black shoes every day, shoes that had started to tear at the edges, but she could not afford new ones. Her pay was barely enough to cover her rent, bills, and a little food. Most weeks she lived off noodles or sandwiches, carefully counting every coin before buying groceries. Sometimes she wished she had chosen another path in life, but deep down she loved serving people. She enjoyed the little smiles she got when she placed a warm cup of coffee on someone's table. It gave her a sense of purpose, even though her own stomach often growled in hunger while she worked. Emily had dreams, big ones, though she never shared them with anyone. She dreamed of having a real home one day, not just a rented room with a squeaky door and broken windows. She dreamed of painting her own walls, planting flowers in her own garden, and waking up without worrying about rent. But every time she opened her paycheck, reality hit her harder than ever. Owning a house seemed like a dream reserved only for people richer, luckier, and more powerful than her. Her cafe shift was long and tiring. From morning until evening, she served endless cups of coffee to strangers. Some customers were kind, giving her small tips that she saved in a jar hidden under her bed. Others treated her like she was invisible, snapping fingers for service without even looking at her face. Yet Emily never let bitterness grow in her heart. She always smiled, always tried to speak with kindness, because she believed every person was fighting their own battles, just like her. The cafe owner was strict but fair. He noticed that Emily never complained, even when asked to stay extra hours. Sometimes she walked home late at night, the streets quiet and empty, clutching her bag tightly against her chest. She couldn't afford a car, so she walked or took the bus, no matter how cold or rainy the weather was. Even then, she whispered small prayers of thanks, because at least she had legs to walk, a job to work at, and a roof over her head. Her friends from school had moved on with their lives, some studying at universities, others working better jobs. Emily never felt jealous, but sometimes she wondered why her journey had to be so hard. Was it because she was too kind? Too soft? Or maybe life was simply unfair? But no matter how heavy her worries became, she never let them show on her face while at work. Customers knew her as the cheerful waitress, the one who greeted them with a warm good morning and remembered how they liked their coffee. On Sundays, when she had a few hours free, she sat by her window and watched families walk by. Parents holding their children's hands, couples carrying shopping bags, teenagers laughing loudly. She watched them with a soft smile, but inside her heart ached. She wanted to give her future children more than she ever had. She wanted stability, comfort, and love. But she knew that dreams didn't come true without sacrifice. So, she pushed herself harder, one day at a time, never giving up. There were nights when she cried silently on her bed, tears soaking her pillow as she thought of bills waiting to be paid. Electricity, water, rent. They came one after the other, like waves she couldn't stop. Her salary disappeared almost the moment she received it. Yet every morning she wiped her tears, tied her hair neatly, and went back to the cafe with a smile. No one could guess how heavy her heart truly was. Emily's kindness wasn't fake. It came naturally to her. When she saw an old man struggling with the door, she rushed to help. When she noticed a child drop a toy, she picked it up quickly with a laugh. She believed that kindness didn't cost anything, and maybe that belief was the only wealth she truly carried with her. Still, loneliness often followed her. Her phone rarely rang, except for bills or work schedules. She didn't go out much, because going out meant spending money she didn't have. Instead, she read old library books, drank cheap tea, and imagined what her life would look like if one day, fortune knocked at her door. She never expected miracles, but sometimes she whispered to herself that maybe, just maybe, something good was waiting for her. That day, the day her life would change forever, began like any other. She woke up to the same peeling paint on her ceiling, slipped into her worn shoes, and walked quickly through the chilly morning air toward the cafe. She had no idea that within hours, her world would take a turn she never thought possible. All she knew was that life was hard, but she had to keep moving, keep smiling, and keep giving the little kindness she could offer. Because that was who Emily was, a struggling waitress with a gentle heart, a girl who believed that even in a world full of struggles, kindness always mattered. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that comes just after the lunch rush, when most people have gone back to work and only a few customers sit with their laptops or books. Emily wiped down the counter slowly, humming softly to herself, enjoying the short break before the evening crowd would arrive. Outside, the sky was gray, and rain tapped gently against the windows, blurring the view of the street. Emily always liked rainy days, though they made the cafe feel a little colder. She poured herself a small glass of water and took a deep breath, preparing for the long hours still ahead. The doorbell jingled as someone pushed the door open. Emily looked up and saw a man walk in. He wasn't like the usual customers she served every day. His clothes looked worn out, as if he had been traveling for days without rest. His shoes were muddy, his jacket had small tears on the sleeves, and his face looked tired, lined with shadows of exhaustion. He carried no umbrella, and his hair was damp from the rain, strands sticking to his forehead. He walked slowly, almost uncertainly, like someone who hadn't been welcomed anywhere in a long time. Emily's heart softened at the sight. She had seen many types of people come and go through the cafe, office workers in suits, students with backpacks, tourists with cameras. But this man was different. He looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, and she could tell from his eyes that he hadn't felt kindness in a while. She straightened up and gave him her usual warm smile, the kind of smile that could make even strangers feel at ease. "Hello," she said gently. "Would you like to sit anywhere you like?" The man nodded slowly and walked to a corner table by the window. He sat down heavily, as though even that simple action required effort. Emily gave him a moment before walking over with her notepad. "What can I get for you today?" she asked softly. The man looked at the menu on the table, then at her. His lips parted, but his voice was weak, almost shaky. "Just a cup of coffee, please," he said. His tone was polite, but there was a hint of embarrassment hidden beneath it. "Of course," Emily replied cheerfully. "One coffee coming right up." She walked back to the counter to prepare the drink, but something about the man stayed in her mind. She noticed how his hands fidgeted nervously, how his eyes darted toward the door as if he might leave at any moment. When she brought the steaming cup of coffee to his table, he smiled faintly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Here you go," Emily said kindly. "Nice and hot, perfect for a rainy day." "Thank you," he murmured, wrapping his cold hands around the cup as though the warmth was the best gift he'd received all day. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and exhaled deeply. It was the kind of sigh that told Emily he needed this coffee more than anything else right now. But then something happened. As he reached into his pocket, his expression suddenly changed. His hand searched one pocket, then another, and his eyes widened with panic. Emily saw him pat his jacket, his pants, even under the chair, but he found nothing. His face turned pale, and he froze, staring down at the coffee cup in front of him. Emily instantly understood. He had no money. For a moment, the man looked utterly defeated. His shoulders slumped, and his trembling hands covered his face. It was clear he hadn't meant to trick anyone. He had simply forgotten, or maybe he truly had nothing left to give. In that second, Emily felt her heart ache for him. She knew too well what it felt like to be short on money, to feel ashamed when you couldn't pay for something small. She walked closer, her voice gentle so no one else would hear. "It's okay," she said softly. "Don't worry about it." The man looked up at her in shock, his eyes wide. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I thought I had some change left. I didn't mean to." Emily shook her head quickly, cutting him off with a smile. "It's just a cup of coffee. Please, enjoy it. Everyone deserves something warm on a rainy day." The man blinked at her, as though he couldn't believe what she was saying. His lips trembled, and for a moment Emily thought he might cry. He swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You don't know how much this means to me." Emily smiled again and walked back to the counter, pretending to busy herself with cleaning, but inside she felt a strange warmth. It wasn't the first time she had done something small for someone in need. She had once paid for a child's cookie when his mother came up short, and another time she gave free coffee to a homeless man who used to sleep near the bus stop. These moments didn't cost her much, but they reminded her that kindness was powerful. As she glanced back at the man, she noticed how differently he held himself now. He sat straighter, his hands steady around the cup, his face calmer. It was as if her small gesture had given him not just coffee, but also dignity and hope. Emily didn't ask questions about who he was or where he came from. She believed everyone had their own story, and sometimes it was better to simply offer kindness without expecting explanations. Outside, the rain kept falling, the cafe still quiet. But something about that moment felt special, though Emily couldn't explain why. She only knew that helping the man was the right thing to do. She didn't realize that this tired stranger was not who he seemed, and that her simple act of compassion would soon change her life in ways she could never imagine. Emily stood behind the counter, pretending to rearrange the napkins, but her mind kept drifting back to the man sitting quietly in the corner. He had taken careful sips of his coffee, almost as though each drop was precious to him. She noticed the way he held the cup close, like someone protecting a treasure. Most customers finished their drinks quickly, but this man was savoring every moment, as if he had been waiting for this comfort for a long time. When she had told him not to worry about paying, his reaction had stayed in her mind. His eyes had filled with disbelief, as though kindness was something rare in his life. Emily had not done it for attention or thanks. To her, it was just a natural thing to do. She knew what it felt like to struggle, to count every coin before spending, to feel embarrassed when money was not enough. She could not let someone else feel that shame, not over something as small as a cup of coffee. As she cleaned the tables, she remembered times when others had shown her kindness. Once, when she was 15, her neighbor had given her family bread when they had no food at home. Another time, her teacher had quietly paid for her school trip because Emily's mother could not afford it. Those small gestures had stayed with her for years, like gentle lights in her memory. She believed those lights had guided her through her hardest times, reminding her that goodness still existed. That was why she never hesitated to pass on kindness to others. The man in the corner noticed too. He watched her as she moved around the cafe, her smile never fading, her steps light despite the obvious tiredness in her body. He could see that her kindness was not something she put on like a mask for work. It came naturally, like the sun rising each morning. Her words had been simple, but to him, they had carried weight. Everyone deserves something warm on a rainy day. It had touched him more deeply than she could imagine. Emily, on the other hand, didn't think much more about it. For her, paying for the coffee was just a small act, nothing worth remembering. She even pulled $1 from her tip jar to cover it. Though that jar was her lifeline, the money she saved little by little for groceries or emergencies. She told herself it was fine. $1 less wouldn't break her, but it might have given the man a piece of dignity back. That thought alone was enough for her to smile. The cafe grew busier as the afternoon went on. A group of students came in, laughing loudly as they ordered milkshakes. A mother with 2 children entered, asking for hot chocolate. Emily rushed around, delivering orders, wiping tables, refilling cups, and keeping her cheerful tone steady. Yet every so often, she glanced at the man. He never left, slowly sipping his coffee and staring out the rainy window, lost in thought. At one point, she brought him a small plate with a biscuit. "On the house," she said lightly. "It goes well with coffee." He looked at her again, stunned. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly, almost suspiciously, as though no one had ever done something nice for him without expecting something in return. Emily shrugged with a small smile. "Because I can. That's all." Then she hurried away before he could ask more. Her words echoed in his mind. Because I can. Simple, honest, without any hidden meaning. He had met many people in his life, people who wanted favors, deals, or recognition. But this young waitress, who probably didn't earn much, was giving without expecting anything back. That kind of purity was rare, and it moved him deeply. As the hours passed, the rain outside turned heavier. The cafe lights glowed warmly against the grey world beyond the glass, making the inside feel cozy. Emily's feet ached from standing, but she kept her spirit bright. She didn't realize that her small gesture had started something far bigger than she could ever imagine. The man in the corner finally finished his coffee. He held the empty cup in his hands for a long while, as though reluctant to let go of the moment. Then he stood up slowly and walked toward the counter. Emily expected him to quietly slip out the door, embarrassed again for not being able to pay. Instead, he paused and looked at her. "You've been very kind," he said softly. His voice was stronger now, steadier than before. "More than you know." Emily gave him a light smile. "I just did what anyone would do." But deep down, she knew not everyone would have done the same. Many people cared too much about money, rules, or appearances. But to her, kindness was worth more than all of that. She didn't need recognition, didn't need thanks. All she wanted was to make life a little easier for the people who crossed her path. The man nodded slowly, studying her with eyes that seemed to search her soul. Emily didn't flinch. She only smiled again, her hands resting on the counter. For her, the day would go on as usual. More orders, more cups of coffee, more smiles to share. She had no idea that the man she had helped was not just any ordinary stranger. She didn't know his name, his background, or the fortune he carried with him. To her, he was simply a tired customer who needed a warm drink and a bit of kindness. What she didn't realize was that her simple action, her choice to pay for a stranger's coffee without hesitation, was about to ripple into something far greater. The man she had treated with respect and compassion would soon turn her entire world upside down. And all of it began with that one small act, an act she thought was ordinary but would soon prove extraordinary. The man stood for a long moment by the counter, his eyes still fixed on Emily, as if he was trying to understand her more deeply. Rain hammered harder against the glass windows, and the cafe grew busier with people rushing in to escape the storm. But to Emily, he was just another customer, another person who had needed a little help. She didn't know that this stranger was not who he seemed to be. To her, he was simply a tired man with no money, sipping on a cup of coffee that she had quietly paid for. But in truth, he was Richard Lawson, one of the most successful businessmen in the country. People knew his name, though few ever saw his face in ordinary places. He was worth billions, owner of companies that stretched across industries, technology, real estate, even charities. But Richard often disguised himself in plain clothes, blending in with the ordinary crowd. He had always believed that true character could only be revealed in simple, everyday moments, not when people recognized his wealth or power. For years, Richard had tested people's kindness this way. Sometimes he walked the streets dressed like an ordinary man, buying food from stalls, sitting on park benches, or stepping into small cafes like this one. Most people ignored him, some turned him away, and a few treated him with impatience when he looked like he couldn't pay. But once in a while, someone showed genuine kindness, kindness that came without judgment. Those rare moments mattered to him more than all the business deals he ever made. As he studied Emily, Richard realized she was different. She had not only paid for his coffee but had done it with a smile, without asking for his name, without looking at him with pity, and without expecting anything in return. She had even brought him a biscuit, just to make him feel comfortable. To him, this was proof of a heart untouched by greed, a spirit that still believed in compassion. Emily had no clue. She was busy taking orders from a group of drenched office workers who had come in, shaking the water off their coats. She balanced trays, scribbled notes, and called out cheerful greetings. To her, it was just another rainy shift. She had long ago stopped dreaming of miracles, believing her life was destined to remain ordinary. Yet, in the corner of the cafe, her small act of kindness had sparked the beginning of something far beyond her imagination. Richard waited until the crowd thinned before stepping closer to the counter again. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady now. When does your shift end? Emily blinked, surprised by the question. Customers rarely asked about her personal life. For a second, she felt cautious. Why do you ask? She said gently, not wanting to be rude but still unsure. Richard smiled faintly, though his smile carried a kind of mystery. Because I'd like to thank you properly. Not just with words. You've done something today that meant more than you know. Emily laughed nervously and shook her head. It was just coffee, she said. Really, you don't need to do anything for me. I was happy to help. But Richard didn't move. His eyes, sharp yet kind, stayed fixed on her. No, he said firmly but softly. What you did was more than that. Most people wouldn't have cared. But you did. And I don't forget things like that. Emily felt her cheeks grow warm. She was used to compliments on her smile or her service. But this was different. There was weight in his tone, as if he saw something in her that no one else noticed. She tried to brush it off, returning to wiping the counter. I finish in about 2 hours, she said finally, almost without thinking. But really, you don't need to wait around. I'm just doing my job. Richard nodded slowly, as though confirming something in his mind. 2 hours, he repeated, more to himself than to her. I'll be here. And he was. For the next 2 hours, Richard stayed in the cafe, ordering nothing more, just sitting quietly by the window, watching the rain. Customers came and went, but he remained still, his thoughts deep and unreadable. Emily tried to ignore the strange feeling of being observed, though every time she glanced at him, his expression was calm, almost peaceful. When the clock struck the end of her shift, Emily untied her apron, stretched her sore shoulders, and sighed with relief. She stepped out from behind the counter, ready to walk home in the rain as she always did. But before she could reach the door, Richard stood up. Would you allow me to give you a ride? He asked politely. It's pouring outside, and I'd feel better knowing you're not walking alone in this weather. Emily hesitated. She had always been careful about trusting strangers. But something about his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, made her nod slowly. All right, she said softly. Just this once. She didn't know it yet, but this moment marked the beginning of an extraordinary turn in her life. The stranger she thought she had helped was about to reveal who he truly was. And the truth would be bigger than anything she had ever dreamed. As they stepped outside together, the rain pouring around them, Emily pulled her jacket tighter, unaware that her life was standing on the edge of a miracle. Richard opened the car door for her, not the car of a poor man, but a sleek, black vehicle that looked far too expensive for someone who couldn't afford coffee. Emily froze for a moment, confused. Wait, she whispered, staring at him. Who are you? Richard gave her a small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that carried both secrets and promises. You'll know soon enough, he said. Emily climbed into the car, her heart racing with both fear and curiosity. She had no idea that the tired stranger she had shown kindness to was a billionaire, a man who held in his hands the power to change her entire world. And in that single moment, as the rain washed over the city, the truth of who he was began to unfold. The rain was still falling hard when Emily climbed into the sleek black car, her shoes squeaking slightly from the wet pavement. She sat nervously, her hands folded tightly in her lap, wondering what exactly she had gotten herself into. She had expected the stranger to own an old car, maybe something simple, but this was nothing like that. The seats were soft leather, the smell of luxury filled the air, and the dashboard glowed with expensive lights. She glanced at the man sitting in the driver's seat, confused more than ever. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain drumming against the windshield and the steady swish of the wipers. Emily finally broke the silence. This doesn't make sense, she said quietly. If you drive a car like this, why couldn't you pay for a cup of coffee? The man glanced at her with a small smile, not answering directly. Sometimes, he said softly, people hide who they really are, just to see the truth in others. His words hung in the air, leaving Emily puzzled. They drove through the wet streets, passing rows of small houses, shops, and flickering streetlights. Emily knew these neighborhoods well. She walked through them every day after work, sometimes stopping to look at houses she could never afford. But tonight, the car kept driving past them, moving toward a part of town she had only seen from a distance. The houses grew larger, the gardens greener, the gates taller. The sidewalks were lined with trimmed hedges and shining lamps. Emily pressed her face slightly to the glass, her eyes wide. It was like entering another world, one that felt far away from her small apartment and long shifts at the cafe. "Why are we here?" she asked nervously. "This isn't my neighborhood." The man, who had still not told her his real name, looked calm, almost amused by her reaction. "I told you," he said gently. "I want to thank you properly. People like you deserve more than a few words." Emily shook her head quickly, almost panicking. "I don't need anything. Really, I don't. You don't have to give me anything. I was just doing the right thing." "That's exactly why," he replied firmly. "You did something kind without expecting anything. That's rare. And when I see something rare, I don't ignore it." Emily didn't know what to say. Her heart beat faster as the car slowed down in front of tall black gates. Beyond the gates stood a mansion so large and beautiful that it looked like it belonged in a movie. The driveway stretched long and wide, lined with glowing lights, and the building itself had grand windows that shimmered in the rain. Emily gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. This can't be real," she whispered. "Nobody actually lives here." "Oh, but they do," the man said with a faint smile. He pressed a button, and the gates slowly opened, the car rolling inside. Emily's heart raced as they drove closer to the mansion. She had never been this close to such wealth in her entire life. She thought of her tiny apartment, with its broken heater and cracked walls, and felt as though she had stepped into another universe. When the car stopped, the man turned to her. His expression was serious now, his eyes focused on her with a kind of warmth that unsettled her. "Emily," he said, speaking her name for the first time, though she was sure she had never told him. "You've spent your life giving to others, even when you had little for yourself. Today, you showed me kindness without knowing who I was. That's something I will never forget." Emily stared at him, speechless. "How do you know my name?" she asked in a whisper. He smiled softly. "I know more than you think. And now, I want to give something back to you." She shook her head in disbelief, her hands trembling. No, this isn't right. You don't even know me. I'm just a waitress. I don't deserve." "Yes, you do," he interrupted gently but firmly. "You deserve more than you believe. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes. Tonight, I want to show you how true that is." He stepped out of the car and walked around to open her door. Emily hesitated but followed him, her legs unsteady as she stepped onto the polished driveway. The mansion loomed above her, its lights glowing warmly against the stormy night. She could hardly breathe. The man led her toward the front steps. Every part of her wanted to run away, to go back to her simple life where nothing extraordinary happened. But curiosity, and something deeper, a spark of hope, kept her feet moving. At the massive doors, he paused and looked at her again. "I haven't told you my name," he said calmly. "I am Richard Lawson." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had heard that name before. Everyone had. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, owner of companies whose names she saw on billboards, news articles, and even products in the cafe. She had never imagined she would meet him, let alone sit in his car. You're a billionaire," she whispered, almost choking on the word. Richard nodded slightly. "And you're the waitress who reminded me that money means nothing without kindness. That's why I brought you here. This house, Emily, is no longer mine. It's yours." Her eyes widened, her mouth falling open in shock. She shook her head violently. No, that's impossible. You can't just give someone a mansion. I can't even pay my rent. How could I live here?" Richard smiled, the kind of smile that carried both wisdom and kindness. "You don't have to understand it right now. All you need to know is that you earned this, not with money, not with power, but with something more valuable. You gave kindness when no one else would. And I believe that deserves the greatest reward. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind spinning. The storm outside seemed to vanish, the world narrowing down to this moment. A tired stranger had walked into her cafe, and now, standing in front of a mansion, she realized her life was about to change forever. ChatGPT said. Emily stood frozen in front of the grand doors of the mansion, the rain still falling softly behind her, the sound like 1,000 tiny drums on the stone driveway. Her hands trembled, her breath quickened, and her heart raced so fast it felt like it would break out of her chest. She stared at Richard, unable to believe what she had just heard. A mansion? Hers? It sounded like a dream, or maybe a trick. How could something like this be real? Richard's eyes, calm yet serious, didn't waver as he looked at her. He didn't look like someone who was joking. His face carried the weight of truth, and yet Emily's mind refused to accept it. She shook her head again and again, almost laughing nervously, her voice breaking as she spoke. No, this isn't possible. You can't just give me a house. I'm nobody. I'm just a waitress who poured you a cup of coffee. Richard smiled gently, but his voice was steady when he answered. That's where you're wrong, Emily. You're not nobody. You're someone who gave kindness when no one else would. You didn't hesitate. You didn't judge me. You gave freely, even when you didn't have much to give. That kind of heart is rare. And that's why I chose you. Emily's knees felt weak, and she held onto the railing of the wide staircase to keep herself from collapsing. But why me? She whispered, her throat dry. There are so many people out there, so many who probably deserve this more. I've never done anything great. I've just been trying to survive. Richard's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice so it felt like his words were meant for her alone. That's exactly why. People think greatness comes from money or fame, but it doesn't. It comes from small, honest acts of kindness. You showed me that. You didn't know who I was, and you still chose compassion. That's a gift many forget in this world. And I will not let it go unnoticed. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She thought of all the nights she had gone to bed hungry, all the times she had counted pennies to make ends meet, all the mornings she had forced herself out of bed to work long shifts at the cafe. She had lived her life believing she was invisible, that no one noticed her struggles or her kindness. And now, here was a man telling her that the very thing she thought didn't matter had changed everything. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of shiny keys. They jingled softly as he held them out to her. These are yours, he said simply. This house is yours now. Every room, every corner, every inch of it. No rent, no bills, no conditions. It belongs to you. Emily gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. The tears she had been holding back spilled over, rolling down her cheeks in warm streams. She shook her head again, overwhelmed, but this time she didn't protest. Her body felt light, as though she was floating, caught between disbelief and wonder. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, hesitant, and touched the cold metal of the keys. When they landed in her palm, she felt the weight of them, heavy and real, not like a dream. She closed her hand tightly around them, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. I don't know what to say, she whispered through her tears. Thank you doesn't feel big enough. This is more than I ever imagined in my whole life. Richard's smile widened, his voice warm. You don't need to say anything. Just promise me one thing. Promise me you'll continue to be the same person you are now. Promise me you won't stop believing in kindness, even when life gets hard. Because that's the real treasure, Emily. Not the house, not the money, but your heart. Emily nodded quickly, her tears falling faster now. I promise, she said, her voice breaking. I'll never stop. He turned toward the doors and pushed them open. They swung wide to reveal the inside of the mansion, and Emily gasped again. The lights glowed softly, casting golden warmth across polished floors. A grand staircase curved upward, its railing carved with delicate designs. The walls were lined with paintings, the ceilings high and sparkling with chandeliers. It was more beautiful than anything she had ever seen in her life. She stepped inside slowly, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Her eyes darted from one corner to another, unable to take it all in. There was a living room with giant windows that overlooked a garden, a kitchen bigger than her entire apartment, and hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. Her hands brushed the smooth surfaces, as if touching them would prove they were real. "It's like a palace," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I feel like I shouldn't even be walking here." Richard chuckled softly. "This place has been waiting for someone like you. Someone who will fill it with love, not just with wealth. You belong here more than anyone." Emily turned to him, still clutching the keys tightly in her hand. Her tears had slowed, replaced with a trembling smile. She didn't understand why life had chosen this moment to bless her, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never forget how it happened. One small act of kindness, something she thought meant nothing, had opened the door to a new life she never dreamed possible. As she stood in the center of the grand hall, the weight of her struggles seemed to lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt hope flooding her heart, bright and powerful, washing away all the doubts that had lived there before. She realized that kindness had not only changed someone else's day, it had changed her entire life. And as she closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the air of her new beginning, Emily understood that miracles sometimes come quietly, disguised as strangers in need, and that even the smallest cup of coffee could lead to the greatest gift of all. Emily stood in the middle of the grand hall, still holding the keys in her trembling hand. Her heart felt like it was beating faster than it ever had before. She tried to breathe, but the air felt heavy with disbelief. She had walked into this mansion as a poor waitress who barely had enough to survive, and now she was standing there as its new owner. The thought alone was too big for her to handle. Her eyes filled again with tears, but this time they were tears of shock and joy, not of sadness. Her chest ached as emotions poured out of her all at once. She thought of all the nights she had gone home to her tiny, cold apartment, curling under a thin blanket and wishing she had something better. She thought of the times she had eaten nothing but bread for dinner, just to save a few dollars for rent. She remembered her shoes with holes in them, her clothes that were worn thin, her tip jar that never filled fast enough. She had carried those struggles for years, believing no one saw her pain, believing her life would always stay the same. And now, in a single moment, all of that had changed. Her knees grew weak, and she sank onto a chair near the entrance, covering her face with her hands. The tears came harder, shaking her body as they fell. She wasn't embarrassed to cry, not here, not now. These were not the tears of defeat she had cried so many times alone in her apartment. These were tears of overwhelming gratitude, of shock, of wonder at the fact that someone had seen her, truly seen her, and chosen to bless her in a way she had never imagined. Richard stood nearby, quiet, giving her the space she needed. He didn't try to stop her tears, because he understood what they meant. He had seen people cry from joy before, but there was something different about Emily. Her emotions were raw, pure, honest. She wasn't thinking about luxury or money. She was thinking about the years of struggle behind her and the sudden light shining in front of her. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, but her smile broke through like sunshine after a storm. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why me? Why did you choose me?" Richard's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Because you remind me of the values I was taught as a child. My mother used to say, it doesn't matter how much you have, if you cannot be kind, you have nothing at all. I lost her many years ago, but her words never left me. And today, when you gave me kindness without hesitation, it felt like hearing her voice again. You brought that lesson back to me, and I wanted to honor it." Emily's tears returned, but this time she smiled through them. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the pounding of her heart. She had always believed in kindness, even when life was unkind to her. She had believed that one smile, one gesture, could matter. Yet she had never expected kindness to return to her in such a powerful way. She stood up slowly and walked toward one of the massive windows. The rain outside had softened, turning into a light drizzle. The garden sparkled under the glow of the lamps, each drop of water glittering like diamonds. Emily pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass, and she whispered softly to herself, "I'm not forgotten." For so long, she had felt invisible, serving countless people, cleaning tables, carrying plates, going home exhausted and unnoticed. But now she realized that even if the world didn't see her struggles, kindness never went unseen. Life had a way of returning it, sometimes in ways greater than anyone could dream. Her thoughts raced back to her co-workers at the cafe, to the customers who came every day. She imagined their faces if they knew what had happened. Some would cheer for her, others might not believe it. But she knew deep down that this was real. She touched the keys in her hand again, the metal solid and cool, a symbol of a new chapter. Richard stepped closer and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emily," he said softly, "I know this feels overwhelming, but you don't have to be afraid. This is not a burden, it's a gift. And you deserve it." She turned to him, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to live like this. I don't know how to belong here. I've never had more than a small room and second-hand furniture." "You'll learn," Richard replied kindly. "And you'll make this place your own, little by little. You have a good heart, and that's what makes any house a home." Emily lowered her head, new tears forming. She thought about how close she had come to giving up hope so many times, about how often she had questioned whether her kindness even mattered. Now she had her answer. It mattered more than she had ever believed. She sank onto the sofa in the grand living room, her hands covering her face again as laughter and tears mixed together. The weight of years of struggle lifted from her shoulders. She thought of the nights she had prayed quietly, asking for just a little relief, just a small sign that things would get better. And here she was, sitting in a mansion, holding keys that symbolized not just a house but a miracle. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, as though her soul was breathing freely. She wasn't just a tired waitress anymore. She was someone who had been seen, chosen, and blessed beyond measure. She looked up at Richard once more, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me. You'll never know how much this means." Richard smiled, his eyes warm. "Kindness always finds its way back, Emily. Remember that." And with those words, Emily realized she was no longer standing in the shadows of her struggles. She was standing in the light of a new beginning, with a heart full of gratitude and a future brighter than she had ever imagined. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mansion, filling the grand hall with a golden glow. Emily woke up slowly, blinking against the brightness, almost forgetting for a moment where she was. For years she had woken up to the peeling paint of her tiny apartment, to the sound of neighbors arguing through thin walls, to the chill of a room with poor heating. But this morning was different. She was lying in a bed so soft it felt like a cloud, wrapped in blankets that smelled of lavender and warmth. She sat up, her eyes wide as she remembered the night before, and a smile crept onto her face. This was real. She wasn't dreaming. The keys lying on the nightstand beside her reminded her it was all true. She got out of bed slowly, her bare feet touching the polished wooden floor. Every step echoed in the silence of the mansion, reminding her of how vast and empty it was. She walked down the wide staircase, running her hand along the smooth railing, her heart still racing with wonder. The house felt almost too big for her, like it belonged to another life, another person. But she told herself that little by little, she would learn to make it her own. When she opened the front doors, she was greeted by the sound of birds singing in the garden. The rain from the night before had washed everything clean, and the flowers sparkled with drops of water. Emily stood there for a long time, breathing in the fresh air, letting it sink in that this was her new life. She had never felt so free. Word about Emily's unbelievable gift spread quickly. The neighbors whispered when they saw her walking down the driveway. Some stopped to wave, their eyes wide with curiosity. Who was this young woman moving into a mansion? Some assumed she must have won the lottery. Others thought she had married into wealth. But Emily smiled politely and said nothing. She didn't need to explain. In her heart, she knew the truth, and that was enough. At the cafe, her co-workers were in shock when she returned to visit. They could hardly believe their eyes when she walked in, her posture straighter, her smile brighter, her clothes newer. But Emily didn't act differently. She still greeted everyone with warmth, still laughed with the same gentle sound, still helped carry plates when someone was too busy. Her kindness had not changed. If anything, it had grown stronger. She remembered Richard's words, "Kindness is the real treasure," and she carried them with her every day. Life in the mansion was a new adventure. At first, the silence of the place felt overwhelming. She was used to hearing buses outside her window, footsteps in the hallway, and the distant hum of the city. Now she walked through endless rooms that echoed with her footsteps. She decided not to let the space make her lonely. Instead, she filled it with life. She opened the windows, let the breeze in, and sometimes even baked cookies in the grand kitchen, just to make the house smell warm and inviting. Emily also began to share her blessings. She invited her co-workers over for tea, letting them see that kindness could truly lead to miracles. She donated to shelters and charities, remembering the nights she had struggled. She even gave small envelopes of money to struggling families she knew from the cafe, doing it quietly, never seeking attention. She wanted others to feel the same hope she had felt when kindness returned to her. But perhaps the most important change was inside Emily herself. She no longer felt invisible. For years, she had thought the world didn't see her, that her kindness went unnoticed. Now she understood that every small act mattered, even when it seemed forgotten. She realized that kindness was like planting seeds. You never knew when or where they would grow, but one day, they might blossom into something greater than you could imagine. Sometimes, late at night, she sat by the tall windows, looking out at the city lights in the distance. She thought about Richard and the way he had looked at her that day in the cafe, the way he had seen her heart when no one else had. She held the keys in her hand, not because she needed to remind herself of the house, but because they reminded her of the moment her life had changed. A moment when one small act of kindness had opened the door to miracles. Emily never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the struggles, the hunger, the tears on her pillow. But she also never forgot the strength those struggles had given her. They had shaped her into someone who could appreciate every blessing deeply, someone who could value not just wealth but the power of a generous heart. Her life was no longer about surviving day to day. Now, it was about giving, about inspiring, about showing others that even in the hardest times, kindness could change everything. She became a symbol in her community, though she never asked to be. People pointed at her and whispered, "That's the waitress who was given a mansion." But Emily smiled softly whenever she heard it, because in her heart she knew the truth. She wasn't given a mansion because of luck. She was given it because kindness had power. And so, Emily began her new chapter not as someone who had simply escaped her struggles, but as someone who carried forward the lesson she had lived. She knew the mansion would one day be filled with laughter, love, and stories of hope. And every time she walked through its grand doors, she whispered a silent promise to herself, to never stop being kind, to never stop believing, and to always remember that miracles can begin with something as small as a cup of coffee. Her life had changed forever, but her heart remained the same. And that was what made her story so extraordinary, not just the mansion, not just the billionaire's gift, but the reminder that even the smallest kindness can echo through the world, touching lives in ways no one can predict.